Thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Ford. I'm the Public Programs Manager here at the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. We are honored to welcome legendary banjo player Tony Trischka to today's Musician Spotlight. Tony is considered the consummate banjo artist and perhaps the most influential banjo player in the roots music world. For more than 50 years, his stylings have inspired a whole generation of bluegrass and acoustic musicians with the many voices he has brought to the instrument. He's raised the banjo's profile in countless ways, including through his theme song for Books on the Air and performances on A Prairie Home Companion, Mountain Stage, From Our Front Porch, and other programs. His frequent presence on NPR, as well as work with his pal Steve Martin, has helped the banjo gain a wider audience and deeper understanding. Over the span of his illustrious career, Tony has released 17 solo albums, beginning with his 1974 landmark debut, Bluegrass Light, to his most recent work, 2024's Earl Jam, a tribute to Earl Scruggs, the latter of which features contributions from Stuart Duncan, Ronnie McCurry, and Daryl Anger, as well as Molly Tuttle, Brittany Haas, Dominic Leslie, and Bronwyn Keith Hines, creating a cross-generational, genre-spanning band of some of the best pickers alive today. He was named a United States Artist Fellow in 2012 and has also won multiple International Bluegrass Music Association awards. Referred to as the father of modern bluegrass by the New York Times, the father of banjo fusion by the Wall Street Journal, and an urban bluegrass whiz by Time Magazine, please help me welcome Mr. Tony Trischka to the Ford stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you want genuine music that will come right back home like a bad quarter, suffuse your system like strychnine whiskey, go right down like Brandreth's pills, and stand out on your hide like the pin feather pimples on a pickled goose. If you want all this, then smash your piano and invoke the glory-beaming banjo. Mark Twain, 1865.
You can applaud. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello and welcome. Nice to see you all here. You having a good time in Nashville? All right. So this is an Earl Scruggs conversation. And I mean conversation because it would be nice to have some questions from you as we go along here, if you have any. And I sometimes say I wouldn't have existed without Earl Scruggs because my whole life has sort of been dedicated to his music, even though I've taken it and stretched it into different directions to put my own stamp on the banjo. But I'm going to talk a little bit about his history, about his background, and some things about his later years. But that tune I played there was something called the Chinese Breakdown. It's a really obscure Earl Scruggs solo. What happened to maybe 2 years ago, I got a hold of someone sent me a thumb drive of jam sessions at Earl Scruggs and John Hartford. Do we have any John Hartford fans here? Yeah. Earl Scruggs and John Hartford jamming between the mid-1980s and the mid-1990s. And it's over 200 tunes. I got these recordings, very rare recordings that almost no one has ever heard. And I started transcribing them, writing out the solos and banjo tablature, and I started thinking, most people will never get to hear this music, so I'm going to do a recording where every solo I take on these tunes that I've found in this thumb drive will be note for note what Earl Scruggs played. And so I put out an album last March called Earl Jam, not Pearl Jam, Thank you, Earl Jam. And so that's sort of how I came to be here at the Country Music Hall of Fame, and it's such an honor to be here. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about Earl and his past to get started. And one of the tunes that's on these recordings is a tune called Shout Little Lulu, and you can hear Earl talking to John and saying, here's a tune I used to play when I was a kid. And it's perhaps almost the earliest example of him, his music, because he didn't start recording until 1945 with Bill Monroe. And Shout Little Lulu's a fiddle tune. He said he would play it for square dances when he was a teenager, when there were no other instruments around. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this so you can get a sense of what Earl was playing somewhere in the kind of mid to later 30s. Thank you. Earl Scruggs started out playing two-finger style when he played bluegrass banjo, and Earl felt that what he played was Scruggs style. And apparently he was backstage at the Opry one time. Well, Grandpa Jones, some of you remember Grandpa Jones, and Grandpa Jones was a wonderful clawhammer, frailing kind of banjo player, and Grandpa was backstage talking to somebody, and, hey, Grandpa, what style do you play? He said, oh, I play that frailing clawhammer style. And then Earl Scruggs walked in, and someone said, hey, Earl, what do you play? I play Scruggs style. It's kind of a Zen thing. Anyway, the first tune that Earl played in the three-finger style, I've got some quotes here. Let me get myself organized here a little bit more than I am at the moment. Here it is. There it is, yeah. Was a tune called Reuben, and he said he was sort of absent-mindedly playing it with just two fingers because he hadn't come in with that three-finger style yet. And he played in this different tuning called D-tuning. And what he played was, I'll play it first in the two-finger style, and then he said it all kind of got smoothed out when I added that middle finger in there. So it goes like this. Thank you. I got friendly with Earl in his later years, excuse me, and had a chance to interview him. And I've got a little quote about playing Reuben from this interview. And he said, Well, I used to play just two fingers, thumb and finger, meaning the index finger. And I was about, I'll say, 10 years old. I was playing that Reuben in the room by myself at home in the country. Earl grew up in Flint Hill, North Carolina, which is right outside Shelby. And I was kind of in the mode where if you'd asked me what I was thinking about, I couldn't even tell you. You sat around almost asleep. You're still picking, not paying attention to what you're doing. And I was playing that Reuben. And suddenly I realized I had this three-finger roll going. It just fit that tune perfectly, just like that. And I played that son of a gun the rest of the week. And Junie, my oldest brother, come over on Saturday, and I couldn't wait for him to get there to see what he thought about my picking. I mean, he just invented Scruggs style, And when he was coming up the road, I was sitting on the edge of the porch, summertime, and I was picking. And he kept turning his head. He'd get a whiff of it. It was the wind blowing, I was sitting on the porch, which was an L shape, and he walked up in the yard, up on the steps, just started in the door, and he said, "Is that all you can pick?" Shocked the dickens out of me for just a second, because I hadn't even retuned the banjo up to G, just played that Reuben for 2 or 3 days. Of course, back then I didn't get to play like I do now, because you always had to turn the cows to milk or something to do on the farm. But anyway, when he said that, it shocked me for a second. I tuned the banjo up to G and started playing something else. Anyway, that's how the three-finger worked. So, is that all you know how to play? Really? I just invented the most important banjo style in the world. And okay, well, Junie didn't know that at the time. Well, when Earl was young, when you're a musician, you like to work with a metronome, that clicking sound that keeps your time going pretty well. And that's how you work on your time. Earl didn't have a metronome, so he and his brother Horace, they would stand out in front of their house, which I've had the chance to go to. It's just way out in the country, and it's a little run down, but it's just like, this is where it all happened. But what they would do is they would play Sally Gooden, like this. Thank you very much. You don't have to applaud. Anyway, it's too short. So they would play that. Earl would stand on, right next to Horace. Horace would walk around one side of the house, and Earl would walk around the other side of the house. And when they got to the back, if they were still in time, they knew their time was pretty good. And if not, they'd go back around to the front. And when I got there, 60 years later, I was expecting to see a well-worn path, but that was long gone. And I tried that recently. This past January, we did this. This is the year of Earl's 100th birthday. It would have been his 100th birthday on January 6th. So on January 6th, we did a show in Shelby honoring Earl. We did it with the Traveling McCurries. And the next day, we went out to the house, and our guitar player and I stood in front of the house and went on opposite sides of the house. And we were not in time when we got to the back. In all fairness, the terrain on my side of the house was a little rough. He had a smoother walk, so just saying, I'm just saying. Let's see, there's this really, a really amazing thing that happened. In addition to my coming upon all these 200 tunes that no one ever heard before from these jam sessions with John Hartford, I got a call from Mary Beth Hartwick from the Earl Scruggs Center in Shelby, about a year ago, and she said after Gary Scruggs died, the last surviving direct member of Earl's family, everything, all of Earl's banjos and ephemera and songbooks and everything went to the Earl Scruggs Center, and they were going through these things, and Mary Beth, she just found this Mickey Mouse notebook. A Mickey Mouse notebook with a nice color picture, actually a photograph of Mickey, it was a painting of Mickey Mouse, and she opens it up, and there in Earl's own handwriting are 60 pages of his thoughts about his childhood, joining Bill Monroe, and how you should approach playing on stage and things like this. And I'd interview Earl a couple of times. He'd never talked about any of this stuff. He talked about his childhood. And I'm just going to read a couple of things from it. But first, this is just talked about playing the banjo on Sunday. He said, this is from this Mickey Mouse notebook. I usually got some picking done on Sunday. Some people called it sinning, depending mainly on how well they liked picking. Picking was a no-no in church. I always thought that it would have made or set things up for a nice service if some of the good singers would quartet, etc., and have string music. But it was an old organ, out of tune, and bad playing in most cases, sometimes no one to play the organ. Just grab a pitch and hope everyone could reach all the notes, singing all day or monthly. And before church, or after, I guess after church, it's a little unclear what he says here, but after church adjourned most Sundays, and you'd have to walk 1 to 3 miles back home and eat. Mr. Newt Harold was, I suppose, among the longest prayers at Flint Hill Church, or at least to me. He was the one I always wished they would not ask to dismiss church in prayer. He seemed to recap what the preacher had said, plus giving his point of view for good measure. Anyway, I was starving. So that's just a little insight into Earl's childhood. Let's see. One of the things that Earl would do, and he told me this, and I think it's in other interviews as well, he said he'd be sitting around at home and playing something on the banjo when he was a kid, and his mother would walk by and say, "Earl, I hear you every day, and I can't hear the melody. Play the melody." And so I found out that what Earl was playing was this right here. Which is, okay, all right. Thank you. It's a tune that became something called Foggy Mountain Special, but Earl, he called it boogie woogie music, and it was a tune called Step It Up and Go, and he was playing, that's one of the hardest things to play besides that Chinese breakdown where you're jumping all over the neck, and apparently that's what he was playing, but his mother was saying, play the melody, and so what Earl would do, especially in his later years, he would play a melody as if he were singing the words on the banjo. Do y'all know Country Roads by John Denver? Yeah, I'll play it the way Earl played it. And see if you can hear the words as I'm playing it. Should we sing that once? Let's all sing this, shall we? You can accompany with your thousands of voices here. 1, 2, 3. Country road. Thank you very much. You sounded great. I'm playing in Johnson City, Tennessee tomorrow night if you want to come along with me. We'll have a big show. But could you sort of hear that what you were singing matched what I was playing and back and forth? It was called Playing the Syllables, and I was talking to John Hartford once about this. And John Hartford would talk about how he would play the syllables when he played the banjo. Anyway, let's see here. Well, bluegrass music as we know it today wouldn't exist without Earl Scruggs joining Bill Monroe back in 1945. I think it was October of 45. And, I'm going to do another reading. This is a little bit longer, but I think it's interesting if you'll bear with me. Let's see. Make sure I have the right pages here. Yeah. Okay, this is again from this Mickey Mouse notebook. I didn't know Bill Monroe, and had always heard he was tough to get along with. Didn't know if he would care at all for my style of picking. But basically, Earl had been playing with a guy named Lost John Miller out of Knoxville, and Lost John was getting off the road, and so Earl was either going to go back into the mills in Shelby or join Bill Monroe. And Bill Monroe's fiddle player, Jim Shoemage, said, "Earl, you got to come and audition for Bill." So Lost John Miller and Earl were heading back to Knoxville, stopped in Nashville, to audition, so Earl could audition for Bill before going back to Knoxville. Then they would both head back to Knoxville. So with that preface, Lost John, who I just mentioned, was wanting to get started back to Knoxville. I was able to stall him a while, telling John my intentions. That wasn't too exciting for John, but since he hadn't paid any of us, he was patient for a couple of hours. It was a different time. I was really so fed up with what I had experienced in John's band, I really preferred to quit show business. It was probably 2 p.m. before Bill showed up, and I lovingly picked him Sally Gooden and Dear Old Dixie. Bill seemed very impressed, but wanted me to stay and go down to the Opry and pick with his band to see how it would sound and to get the other guy's opinion, I suppose. I told him my ride was leaving, and he said he would pay my bus ticket if I would stay. There was an 11 p.m. Tennessee coach bus out that night that would get me into Knoxville, 7 or 8 a.m. Sunday morning. We picked, and about 10:50 I picked up my banjo and told Bill I was catching the bus. So I told him I was very sick, had to get my clothes in Knoxville before coming back to Nashville to join Bill Monroe, and that I was going to Shelby to try to get well. He said, be back next Saturday. I said, all sounds well, except nothing had been said about what he paid or anything. He said, I pay everybody the same, $60 a week, $10 for Sunday. And you pay your hotel and food plus any other expenses. What a deal. I caught the bus, paid for my ticket, which Bill never refunded me, got on the bus the last minute, all seats were taken, and I stood in the aisle all the way with the chills. My back hurt so bad from the hard chills, I sat on the cold floor part of the way. Got to Knoxville. Lost John and Dora, his wife, were in bed. I told him Bill had given me a job and explained my sick problem and asked him to take me approximately 2 miles to catch the city bus or take me into town, but he refused. I walked in the snow and waited for the bus. What an ordeal. Thank you, Bill Monroe, for making me do this. Okay, and this is the last part here. This is going back to the audition. When Bill came to the Tulane Hotel, it must have been at least 1 or 2 p.m., being sick with the flu and having a fever, my patience had almost expired. But Jim Shoemate, the fiddle player who had said he should audition, kept assuring me Bill would be there any moment. John naturally wanting to get back to Knoxville, I wouldn't have blamed John if he had departed hours earlier, but he remained fairly calm. Bill finally came buttoned up snugly in an attractive overcoat and scarf around his neck. This was my first musician to have almost shoulder-length hair. He had a beautiful head of hair with it, as people around home used to say, bobbed off hanging neatly on his scarf and overcoat collar and a full, almost earlobe of sideburns. But he had all the appearance of a pro musician. I picked Bill a tune, and he began almost to shuffle as he pranced around in the room. A big smile, but not much of anything was said. I picked a bit of another tune with about the same reaction and put the banjo in the case. I explained my situation and said I would catch John before he left me. Anyway, I love that he sees Bill Monroe for the first time. What a beautiful head of hair. It's like just these insights, just this whole new look at Earl Scruggs with these 60 pages. One of the tunes that Earl played, actually the very first thing that Earl played and recorded with Bill Monroe was a tune called Heavy Traffic Ahead, which had the same solo I just played for Foggy Mountain Special. But another thing that Earl played was Bluegrass Breakdown that Bill Monroe claimed that he wrote. What does that sound like to you? Thank you. What does that sound like to you banjo aficionados? Sorry? It sounds like Foggy Mountain Breakdown, doesn't it? Well, it turns out that Earl Scruggs wrote Bluegrass Breakdown, which Bill Monroe kind of borrowed, shall we say, and took credit for, which is what band leaders would do back then. And that chord progression goes, not to get too deep into the woods, but into the weeds, I should say, but goes to an F chord. Earl Scruggs turned around and went, thank you. That's Foggy Mountain Breakdown. So just by changing one chord, Earl made a lot of money. Because apparently, as the story goes, Earl told me this, that they were just sort of sitting around at home, he and Louise, his wife, and I'll get talking about Louise in just a moment. And they're sitting around at home and with a friend of theirs, and the phone rings, and the friend goes, answers the phone, and they talk for a minute. And the friend says, it's someone from Hollywood named Warren Beatty. And Warren Beatty's doing a movie, and he wants to use Foggy Mountain Breakdown in the movie. And Warren Beatty was so cool that he wanted the 1949 original version of it as opposed to the later version. And that's how we all know Foggy Mountain Breakdown for the car chase scenes in Bonnie and Clyde. Let's have a hand for Warren Beatty. Thank you, Warren, for giving us Foggy Mountain Breakdown. And now I mentioned Louise Scruggs, and I know there's a forum they have here regularly about Louise Scruggs. Louise Scruggs was the first woman to become a booker and a manager in Nashville in the mid-'50s, and she booked Flatt Scruggs. And I got friendly with Louise in her later years, and she said that people would call up the Scruggs home, and they were living, I think, in Madison at the time, right here, almost in Nashville, just outside Nashville. And she would pick up the phone, and the person at the other end of the line would say, hi, I'd like to speak to Earl. And Louise would say, oh, what's it about? And they'd say, well, I want to book Flatt Scruggs. She said, well, you can talk to me. And she said, well, I'd rather talk to Earl. Well, you talk to me or you don't get Flatt Scruggs. So that's what she was up against in the mid-'50s. And she did so much for their career. And for instance, in 1962, they played Carnegie Hall. Flatt and Scruggs were playing Carnegie Hall. And it's one of their most beloved albums. It's a great album. And Louise thought, we should actually record this. That would be a nice footnote in Flatt and Scruggs' career, but let's record it. So she calls up Columbia Records and says, I want you to get a remote unit out there and record Flatt and Scruggs at Carnegie Hall. And the person at Columbia Records said, how do we do that? And she said, well, you get some wires and you get a microphone, you put a tape recorder at the side of the stage, and you got it all together. Oh, this is what she told me. I can't believe that Columbia Records didn't know how to record a live show, but anyway. And then she said, remember the Beverly Hillbillies? You remember that show, some of you? And that became, the banjo part became, the introduction became a big hit. And Louise thought, everyone loved the music, but no one could get it. It wasn't on a recording. So Louise called Columbia Records again and said, let's record Flatt and Scruggs doing the Beverly Hillbillies theme, the Ballad of Jed Clampett. And they recorded it, and within 2 weeks it went to the top of the charts. So Louise had a lot to do with shaping the career of Flatt and Scruggs. Bill Monroe, on the other hand, didn't have that luxury of having a manager, especially of Louise's caliber. And it was only during the folk music boom, or scare as they say, of the early 60s, he started going to these folk festivals. And a lot of the bluegrass groups were trying to get in on the folk music boom. The Stanley Brothers had a bluegrass hootenanny album, for instance. And Bill Monroe was doing some folky kind of songs, but that's why Flatt and Scruggs are so preeminent. A lot of it was because of Louise Scruggs. Now, speaking of the Beverly Hillbillies, can we do this? Can we do all three verses? Would you sing along on this? You seem like you're game. We'll have a hootenanny right here in the Country Music Hall of Fame. I'm going to play it once through, and then we'll do all three verses. And then I'll tell you about the obscure fourth verse. Did you know there was a fourth verse? And after I read it to you, you'll know why it never made the cut. All right, I'll play it once. Stay silent, and then you'll all sing. Thank you very much. Listen to my story about a man named Jed. Everybody. For a mountaineer Babby kept his family fed. Then one day he was shooting at some food. Up from the ground came a bubbling crude oil, that is black gold Texas tea. Thank you. Now the next thing you know, old Jed's a millionaire. The kinfolk said, they said California is the place you ought to be, so they loaded up their truck and moved to Beverly Hills, that is. Swimming pools, movie stars. Excellent. Now it's time to say goodbye to Jed and all his kin. They would like to thank you folks for kindly dropping in. You're all invited back next week to this locality to have a heaping helping of their hospitality. Beverly Hillbillies. It gets quiet around this time. Nice folks. Y'all come back here. All right, thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, so the obscure fourth verse, which you can find it if you dig deep enough. Old Jed bought a mansion, lordy, it was swank. Next door neighbors, the president of the bank. A lot of folks complaining, but the banker found no fault, because all Jed's millions was a sitting in the vault. Redemption funds, stocks and bonds. And you wonder why you never heard the fourth verse. Let's see here. I think Paul Henning did, the guy that was the producer of the show. And so a friend of mine, first of all, are there any questions? I haven't taken any questions yet. Any questions from... Old Jed's a millionaire. There you go, exactly. My wife says that, the first thing you know, and you got to finish it with that. So no questions right now? Yes? Did they record the fourth verse ever? No. It's just, you got to go to just got to Google it. And even then it's sort of hard to find, but I found on something called Banjo Hangout, there's supposedly a fourth verse about Winston cigarettes. Remember, Winston tastes good like a cigarette should. Remember that? God, what a time. Anyway, any other questions from the assembled masses here? Yes. Yes.
You talk about Bill Monroe taking credit for what Earl wrote. How about with Flatt and Scruggs? Did they divide composing credits fairly, generally?
I can't get into that. Anyway, let's move along. No, but what they would do is they would take traditional tunes and take credit for their arrangement, like public domain tunes, and for the publishing it was Certain and Stacy, which was Louise Certain and Louise Certain and Gladys Stacy. It was Flatt and Scruggs, their wives' maiden names. And that's how they would take credit for tunes. They weren't stealing them; they were just putting their names on a traditional tune because it was their arrangement. And Jimmy Martin, the king of bluegrass, not the father of bluegrass, but the king of bluegrass, recorded "Little Maggie," which is a way traditional tune. And he called it "Little Maggie, She's So Sweet." I wrote that, and that's what people would do. So, and in terms of how they divided the money, I'm not sure. I'd hesitate to guess on that. Anything else? Yes?
When it came to developing the three-finger rule, didn't some of it come from some of the pickers around where Earl grew up, like Snuffy Jenkins? Wasn't he doing a rudimentary?
Yes, Snuffy Jenkins it wasn't even rudimentary. I had a chance to interview Snuffy Jenkins a couple of times, which was really an amazing experience. I said, "Can I interview you?" And he said, "I don't have much to say. It'd just be like interviewing yourself." This is what he said. That's another whole story. I was sitting in with a group called the Violent Femmes. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, in New York City. And the sound check was at 7 o'clock or something like that. And the gig was at 1 a.m. It was that kind of a thing. And, it was a really kind of a punk audience, folk punk audience, I guess you could say. And so my friend who was a mandolin player, we wanted to do something, go to a movie or something. We opened the paper, and there's Snuffy Jenkins and Pappy Sherrill, his musical partner, playing in New York City that night. And we hailed 6 cabs to find out where White Street was, which was where they were playing. And no one knew where it was in the days before GPS. And finally, we found a cab, took us there. We figured we got there half an hour late. We missed the first set. We probably missed Snuffy and Pappy because there were a few people on the bill. But no, we saw their whole show. And so I got to see Snuffy play live, which was amazing. And then went to his hotel room the next day and interviewed him. And I said, Snuffy, you played Dear Old Dixie, which Earl played. Earl played Dear Old Dixie, something like this. And that's how Earl played it. Thank you. And then I asked Snuffy. Now, Snuffy Jenkins, I think he was from South Carolina. I know he was in his later years, he was in South Carolina. But he said that, and Earl said also, that the two of them would like go to fiddle contests together, and they would hang out together. And it's a little hard to know who influenced who. But I asked Snuffy, and Snuffy had mentioned in this interview that he had played Dear Old Dixie, and I asked, could you play that for me? And I recorded it, and I slowed it down to half speed. And this is how Snuffy played it. Which is, you know, Earl went, and Snuffy went. So, very similar. So, it's hard to know who influenced whom, but yes, Snuffy was around. There was another guy named Smith Hammett, who lived in Flint Hill, who played a three-finger style, but Earl said he was never influenced by him. But Snuffy Jenkins said that Smith Hammett played Sally Gooden out of this position, which is a very common banjo position. So, anyway, I find that really interesting to find all these confluences between the two of them. Does that answer your question? You're welcome. Okay, one more question, and then I'll move along. Yes.
I've read the Foggy Mountain Breakdown.
Yeah.
The 1949 recording, where Earl wrote it going to an E minor chord.
Right.
But Lester would not play the E minor chord sometimes and play the E major chord.
Yep.
And so on that recording, he's playing the E major, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
And did Earl at first not like that, and then later on come to think, well, maybe that dissonance really helped make the recording, or how did Earl feel about that? Did you talk ever?
I wish I had. I never asked him about that. I wish I had. But yeah, when you get to like old-time music, which preceded bluegrass and still exists today, but these old recordings from the 20s and 30s, there'd be extra beats. The chords would be kind of weird like that. Like Earl went on an E minor, and you're talking about Lester Flatt playing an E major chord on the guitar. Plus, Earl's playing two measures, not to get too technical here, but Earl's playing two measures of E minor, 1 and 2 and, whereas the band, including Lester's, going 1 and 2 and 3 and, so they're doing 3 measures of E major while Earl's playing 2 measures of E minor, and Earl would flip things around and do just the opposite. Like on Shuckin' the Corn, he plays 3 measures of C while the band plays 2 measures of C. So all these kind of quirky things that you don't find in bluegrass, everything's too normal now. Everything's perfect. And after many years, I found that Earl Scruggs actually missed a note here and there. He was not perfect as much as... Anyway, thank you. I had a chance, the first time I really got to hang out with Earl, I went to his house in Madison, as I was saying, and Earl Scruggs opened the door. Wow, it's Earl Scruggs, and we're at his house. And I was with a friend, and we went in there, and there was a little couch that my friend and I sat on, and Earl was there in a big overstuffed easy chair, and I thought it was like almost meeting the Pope. Am I supposed to kneel down and kiss his picks, or I wasn't sure. And we talked about the weather for about 10 minutes or something like that, or 5 minutes maybe, and then I started asking him about the old days, just to kind of kick things into a different gear. And he said that his banjo would have, these are plastic heads on the banjos now, but they used to have skin heads. And so he would put the banjo in front of a fire on a hot and humid day in the fireplace just to kind of tighten up the head, dry out the head so it wouldn't be too loose. And then he mentioned how right after they did the Beverly Hillbillies, Earl got a call from Paul Henning, who produced that and wrote the lyrics to the aforementioned Jed Clampett, and that they were starting a new show that was really one of the highest attainments of culture in America, really, Petticoat Junction, which I've actually started doing at shows. And Paul Henning wanted Earl to be the engineer in Petticoat Junction, and Earl said, "Oh, it'll break up Flatt and Scruggs." So Paul Henning said, "Well, we'll fly you back to the Opry on the weekends." But Earl demurred, and so bluegrass history would have been different if Earl, because Lester and Earl, as some of you may know, were on the Beverly Hillbillies not infrequently as guests, and I guess Paul Henning really liked how they liked his charisma, so. Anyway, let's see. Just got so much I want to talk about here. Right, Earl Scruggs, he has a quote that I found that you should never encore the past. When I see a bright light shining out there, I want to move toward it. He was always a forward-thinking kind of guy. Even this stuff, I mean, that was like he was doing that in the 30s, and that was really jazzy stuff. He would do this like, it's like big band Glenn Miller kind of stuff. He was doing jazz like when he was a kid. And as he went on, he was just always trying to explore different things after Flatt and Scruggs broke up. And Flatt and Scruggs broke up in 1968. Now, why did they break up, you might wonder? Because Flatt and Scruggs, well, I think Louise and Earl wanted to move in a more rock and roll direction, shall we say, and they started doing various kind of tunes in that realm. And they played at the Avalon Ballroom out in San Francisco where, Big Brother and the Holding Company and Hendrix and everybody would play. And so one of the last tunes that Flatt and Scruggs recorded was a tune called Rainy Day Women 12 and 35. If we have any Bob Dylan fans out here, you may know this song. It's not, and to hear Lester Flatt sing this is like really an amazing experience. He sounds so uncomfortable because he was going in a more traditional direction. Earl wanted to kind of stretch things. So I don't know all the lyrics, even though our singer does it in our show, but they'll stone you when you're trying to be so good, and, they'll stone that just like they said they would. It's all about getting stoned. And then the punchline is, everybody must get stoned. And I do this at shows, and besides singing Jed Clampett, they sing that. And I'm not proposing that anyone should do this, but it's Lester Flatt saying that lyric, and it's like, wow, and hear the Foggy Mountain Boys singing "Everybody Must Get Stoned." It's like, really? Anyway, after Flatt and Scruggs broke up, Earl told me that his boys, Randy, Gary, and Steve, would be jamming in their garage, an actual garage band, and Earl went over to them one day and said, "Hey, can I sit in with you guys?" "Earl, it's your sons," but anyway. And they said, "Sure, Dad," and that became the Earl Scruggs Review. And the Earl Scruggs Review, I'm not sure how long they were out there, but here's Earl playing these rock and roll venues and playing for a whole bunch of people, like in the early 70s into the 80s. And I was playing festivals in the 70s. And what happened is all the rock festivals got shut down, and a lot of the long-haired folks and motorcycle gangs and whatnot would all gravitate towards these bluegrass festivals. So it was a very interesting time for bluegrass festivals. They weren't quite as family-oriented as they are today. But Earl would be playing these kind of places. And anyway, he was very forward-thinking. And somewhere, can't remember exactly when it was, maybe the early 80s, a gentleman did a documentary on Earl called Earl Scruggs, Family and Friends. And Earl, they got Doc Watson to play along, Joan Baez. Bob Dylan did 3 songs with Earl, including Nashville Skyline Rag. Anyway, thank you. So he would play that, and so they had all these people, these great folks, the Byrds with Clarence White playing, Earl playing with them in this documentary. And while they're sort of in the midst of filming this, Randy Scruggs was a big fan of Ravi Shankar, if you know who that is. It was a sitar player, an Indian sitar player, and he was coming to Nashville. And so they tried to get a film crew to film it, but they couldn't. But Ravi Shankar came over to Earl's place, and they jammed together for a while. And at the end, Earl told me this. Earl said to Ravi, "What would you like? What would you like for lunch?" And Ravi said, "Let's do Kentucky Fried Chicken." So if you know Ravi Shankar, you should check him out sometime. Like a virtuoso beyond virtuosic in Indian classical music. You don't hear about him so much these days. George Harrison, the Beatles, was a fan of his and friends with him. But anyway. Let's see, I only have a couple more minutes here. Let me just see if I can finish off with a couple of other things here. Let's see. Earl had a very dry sense of humor. Bela Fleck and I were doing these, if you know any Bela Fleck fans here, I'm imagining some of you are. We've been good friends for a long time, and we were doing duo shows in the early 90s. And we were doing a workshop at Merlefest in North Carolina. Somewhere in the early 90s, and I went over to Bela's hotel to go up and practice, what we were going to do. So I met Bela in the lobby, and we go to the elevator to wait to go up, and out comes from the elevator doors open. Out comes Earl and Louise Scruggs, and again, it's Earl, but it's Earl Scruggs, But Earl Scruggs had just bought Tammy Wynette's and George Jones's mansion here in Nashville, and I said to Earl, "So Earl, I hear you have a new house." He said, "Well, it ain't exactly new." Very dry, very dry. And there's a guy named Neil Rosenberg who writes a monthly thing for something called the Bluegrass Situation. I just found this last night, and he was talking about this guy that had opened up for the Earl Scruggs Review, and this guy said that at the very end of Earl's set, as he walked back out for his third or fourth encore, he stopped and said to me, "If I just play the damn thing right, I wouldn't have to keep going back out." Anyway, I love that. And then another quote from Earl, which I thought was really beautiful. He said, actually, before I say that, one more story. You know Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars? It should have been played by Earl Scruggs. He was like the all-knowing, wise, gremlin-like guy. And so I was seeing Earl at a place called B.B. King's on 42nd Street in New York City. And I'd go backstage afterwards, and Earl was playing great. This was in his later years. And I would go backstage, and I'd see Gary there. The rest of the band had already gone back to the hotel. And Gary would say, "Why don't you go back and hang out with Dad?" Sure, I'll hang out with Earl Scruggs and just chew the fat for 20 minutes. So we're back there talking, and this woman comes in a little bit drunk, and she works there, and she said, "I'm a waitress here, and they're not paying me right, and I'm waiting to get my money." And she was kind of going on, and she said, "Who are you?" And I identified myself, and she said, "I'm Earl Scruggs." "It's Earl, but she had no idea. And so she's going on for 4 or 5 minutes, and I was about to stand up and I wasn't even going to know what I was going to say. I didn't want her to be bothering Earl, with this going on and on. And as I was about to do that, Earl just looked up at her and said, "Nice to meet you." And she said, "Nice to meet you." And she walked out. It was sort of like not Obi-Wan Kenobi, what's the Alec Guinness? Sorry? Yoda? No, not Yoda. What is his name? Alec Guinness. Anyway. He said, "These are not the droids you're looking for," and they just walked in. Anyway, it was a Star Wars moment. Oh, well, that didn't land, did it, at all? God, things were going so well. Anyway, any last questions? Yes? Where do you see bluegrass in Nashville this week? Probably nowhere, because everyone's over at IBMA this week, the Station Inn is the place. For bluegrass here, Station Inn is the place. But the International Bluegrass Music Association Fun Fest is happening in Raleigh, North Carolina, which we're heading up to in a couple of days. So a lot of folks are up there. But yeah, Station Inn is the place to go to hear bluegrass. You're welcome. Anyone else? Okay, I'll finish off with this one quote. I've got 3 more minutes, I think. Okay, I just wanted to mention this because Earl told me this story. One of the first tunes that Earl Scruggs wrote was a tune called Earl's Breakdown. When you're a banjo player, you're supposed to name a tune after yourself. And so I was having dinner with Earl and his son out in Missouri a few years ago, and we were talking about dreams, and Gary Scruggs said, "Dad, tell Tony how you wrote Earl's Breakdown." And Earl said he dreamt this thing where you detune the banjo, you take a note and go. You like that? You want to hear it again? That was really hard. Anyway, so Earl dreamt that he was detuning the banjo like this. That's pretty good. I do it perfectly every time, right? I'm so talented. Okay, trade secret. I've got these special stops on the string which makes it go back and forth perfectly. God, why do it's like a magician telling their trick. Anyway, but when Earl came up with this idea in 1952 or thereabouts, he did it by ear. He didn't have the special tuner. He just did it by ear. And so the tune goes like this. All right. Thank you. And so that's really the hook of the tune, this business here. Anyway, so Flatt and Scruggs go into the studio around 1952, maybe 53, and record this. In the first take, Earl nails it perfectly every time. And it's really hard to do by ear. He didn't have the fancy tuners that I've got here. And so the fiddle player said, "Oh, wait, I didn't like my fiddle break." Okay, so they do a second take, and the fiddle player, "Yeah, that's great, I loved it." So the next day, Earl Scruggs calls up the engineer and says, "Look, I don't care about that dang fiddle player. I like that first take we did of that. I got it perfectly." Because the second take, and it's the one we know, the second take, Earl, at some point in the tune, went and didn't quite get all the way up there, and the way he would have ended that part of the solo would have been. You like that? You want to hear that again? Yeah. But what he did, instead of doing that, he knew it would sound like that, so he kind of went, and then went off mic and retuned it. Anyway, so he calls up the engineer and says, "Look, let's not take that second take. We'll take the first take." And the engineer said, "Oh, we recorded over the first take with the second take because of the dang fiddle player." Oh well. Anyway. I'll finish off with this Earl Scruggs quote, which is, "Music has the power to heal, to uplift, and to bring joy. I always wanted my music to do that for people," which I thought was a really wonderful thing, that was what he wanted to do. I'm going to finish off with just a little bit of Cripple Creek. How many banjo players do we have here? Do we have any banjo players? All right, good. Thank you. Glad you're here. Do you play Cripple Creek? Anyway, we all know Cripple Creek. If you're a banjo player, you probably play Cripple Creek. And in these recordings with John Hartford, he did some really crazy things in them. He plays like a blues solo, and it's a fiddle tune. It's not a blues tune, but Earl plays in this one take of one of these jams, plays this blues thing. So I'm going to finish with that. I want to thank you all so much for being here. It's been a joy talking to you and interacting with you and having you sing so beautifully. And I want to thank Dan on the sound back there. Thank you, Dan. Let's have a hand for Dan up there. Thank you. And I want to thank Ben for getting me here and being my host. And I want to thank all of you again. And I'll play out with just a little bit more of Cripple Creek, or a little of Cripple Creek. Thank you, folks.